He's gone to Southall to live with his mother, whom he doesn't particularly like. He's home from Harrow, and his ancestral estates, which he inherited at the age of 10, Newstead Abbey, are in ruins and let out to a nobleman named Lord Grey. And he's been hanging out there over the summer, as you would if you had ancestral ruins. And he has fallen in love with his cousin Mary Chaworth, who has the estate next door. So the people you used to know are Mr. Musters, who is the landed gentleman who is probably going to marry Mary Chaworth. Mary, his cousin, with whom he's in love, Liz Piggott, who's a friend from Southall, who may be in love with him. Her mother, Mrs. Piggott. Anybody else? I think that's about it. And they have just they're going on a journey to see some caves, because it's the kind of thing you do if there's no television. I'm not going to try to do Byron's accent. We arrived at last at a station a few hundred yards distant from the caverns, where there was a small cottage with a hut attached to it and a hitching post in the yard. Mr. Musters, who had by this stage thoroughly taken charge of the party, gave Saunders, the coachman, instructions regarding the horses, and the rest of us arranged ourselves in no very great order around the yard and stretched our legs. It was now 3 o'clock, and still cloudless and windless, not excessively hot. The shadows had begun to stretch in the sun. Elizabeth said to me, "Mr. Musters is quite charming, and exactly the kind of man my brother dislikes." "Why do you quiz me about Mr. Musters?" I said to her. "He is nothing to me." "I believe he may be something to Miss Chaworth." "That is their own affair. I am not in the least in love with her." "Perhaps I won't tease you," she said. "You look very solemn. Ruins the sport." The cottage belonged to a farmer who offered us one of his sons as a guide for not much money. And after a brief negotiation in which I played no part, he led the way up a steep single track with grass growing in it. This son was very tall and already a little stooped. He said nothing, but walked in long strides, carrying across his shoulders a kind of sack. The rest of us pursued him at a short distance. Mr. Musters gave his arm to Mary. They were followed first by Mr. Beecher and Elizabeth, and then John and Miss Wollaston. Mrs. Piggott and I trailed a little behind the others, which suited both of us, as she's a thin, frail, weak-winded woman, and we could scramble up, as she put it, at our leisure. "You are much missed in Southall," Mrs. Piggott said to me, "and much talked about. All the ladies pine after you." "I think you don't mean Elizabeth. I think you mean my mother." "Oh, Elizabeth talks about you too." There was a short general pause while we turned to look at the view, which had expanded beneath us until it included much of Castleton and the fold of the hills. The sound of the Peak's Hole was already becoming louder, and we could see the water falling and making its way by fragments, perhaps 100 yards ahead of us, and then appearing again beneath our feet more sluggishly and silently as it approached the village. "I have an idea," I said, "that I am always happiest among hills. Flatlands oppress me. I was raised among hills in Aberdeen, perhaps that accounts for it. And there's a view from Harrow Hill that I am greatly attached to. Your mother complains that you have no notion of returning. Confess, Mrs. Piggott, my mother is always complaining. I will say just this much, that she shares with you a passion for opposition. I have no such passion. It is just because I wish to live peacefully that I mean in future to keep my distance from her and Harrow. There's a master there who abuses his rights over me. It must come to blows in the end. And as I have no particular liking for scrapes or for myself in a rage, it seems only sensible to put myself out of the way of temptation. But where will you live? At Newstead. Lord Grey makes no objection. There are certain objections a mother might make to Lord Grey, she said. Besides, I think you mean Annesley. We continued our ascent and said nothing for several minutes. Mrs. Piggott had grown quite pale, and we both labored somewhat against the loose stones of the path. Peak's Cavern eventually made its appearance above our heads like a great faceless cowl, all black within, in spite of the afternoon sun. "I must say," she said, "I have never understood this appetite for nature. I have come along to be pleasant, but left to myself, I had much preferred a good provincial town, with a church not too far, to be walked to and looked at before you return quite pleased with yourself to dine at the hotel." And then, Miss Chaworth was a very pretty, spirited sort of a girl. She appears not at her best in company. I believe She is not very happy. That is because you're in love with her. We always suppose that someone must be miserable if we're in love with them, probably because it makes us a little miserable ourselves. Oh, Mrs. Piggott, I had rather you mocked me as your daughter does, because then I should be less inclined to burst into tears. Perhaps you mean to, after all. You are smiling. Dear sweet child. Not for the world, she said. It is only because, for a moment, you sounded so much like the boy from Aberdeen Lizzie is always teasing you for being. Oh, Mrs. Piggott, but it was not a smile. Indeed, I did have a smile. And with that, we reached the top. The others had arrived already. Our guide struck a light and then distributed the torches he had been carrying in his sack to each of the gentlemen in turn. I received mine, too. The entrance to the cave looked mean and dirty, but the view was very fine across the valley, broken up into fields with the shallow gray glitter of castles into the east. Above us, a high forehead of limestone reared itself, covered in trees and mosses. I grew quite dizzy, leaning back with my hands on my hips to glimpse the top. The path had broadened towards the cliff face, and the entrance itself was as wide as the clearing in which we stood. But the color of the cave mouth had lightened from black to dreary. Mr. Mustard and John had already advanced some distance, torches in hand, to examine the walls. Most of the women followed uncertainly behind. Mrs. Piggott left me to join her daughter. For the first time, I became aware of the fact that Mary stood some way apart, with her back to the entrance, as if her attention were entirely taken up by the view. I remembered she had been walking with Mr. Mustard. I called to her, approaching, and she turned around with a smile and took my arm but said nothing. And together we followed the others into the cave. The air was much cooler inside, and damp and stony. It smells of Newstead, I said, where the river has got into the cellars. And my words changed as we walked, first diminishing and then growing again in volume as they found their echo. Gradually the light of day behind us was replaced by the uncertain glow of our torches, and the cold deepened. Miss Wollaston's voice reached us, doubled and redoubled by the cavern walls. She had found something to laugh at, and then her laughter frightened her, and her fear amused her again. Ahead of us we could see, by torchlight, Miss Wollaston on the arm of Mr. Mustard, Elizabeth and her mother walking together, and John and Mr. Beecher arm in arm. The first chamber gave way to a second, and here indeed, perpetual fall of water curtained one of the walls, and disappeared again into God knows what depths. The sound of the water was loud enough to absorb any other, and we all stood silently for a minute. There is an intensity of noise that acts with the force of a blow. After 100 paces, the path began to taper. The walls of the cavern encroached upon the ceiling, and the space in which a man might walk upright narrowed as I heard Mr. Beecher saying, "To a shoulder's breadth, look out, look out." The farmer's son crouched by the side of the wall to let us pass, then stuck a torch into the ground. It had grown dark enough by this stage that the light of day behind us had become indistinguishable from the mineral glow and vague, aqueous gleams brought out by our own lights. And since the walls of the cavern to either side gave way in many places to several smaller passages and false fronts, he wished, I suppose, to mark the path of our return. Kindling another torch against the flames of the first, he crept alongside me again to the front of the party. Mary, who had begun to shiver against my arm, said, "I don't want to go on. I can't go on." "It's only the cold," I said. "It's nothing worse than the cold. I have begun to feel very strange. I have begun to feel that you are all strangers to me. It is only the strange sounds, that none of you can be trusted." "What do you mean?" I said, feeling her panic suddenly myself. "I am only your dear little Byron." This struck me almost as a confession of love, and perhaps it struck her in the same light, for it seemed to calm her, and she said nothing in reply. By this point, we could no longer hear the others. There was a glimmer of light reflected ahead of us, and then that light disappeared. I gave Mary the torch. She was most unwilling to take it, and walked ahead for 15 or 20 paces, where I was stopped first by an overhang of rock, and then by the body of slow-moving water beneath it, the source of the reflection and also of renewed noises echoing along the surface. I could hear the slap and glide of a boat, and more distantly the sound of human voices. But then Mary's cries interrupted them and forced me to retrace my steps, for she was calling, "Do not leave me, Byron, 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 come back." I returned to her and took the torch from her hand again. After another minute, another torch appeared, and then in its light, the face of the farmer's son. He was dripping and wet through from the waist. "Are you the last?" he said. His accents were not at all rough, but sensible, rather than kindly. "You'll have to lie down in the boat. You'll get a knock if you try sitting up." "There isn't room for you in it," Mary said, when she saw the boat, a shallow wooden punt which was tied to a post by the shore of the river, if one may speak of shores in those dark spaces. "That's all right. I'm used to pushing." And with a strange sort of obedience, she lay down in the boat, and I lay down beside her. The journey lasted no more than a minute or two. I don't know that I've ever passed a minute of such intensity in my life before, and perhaps never will again. All the time we were conscious of the farmer's son at our feet, pushing his way through cold water with bowed head. We could not see him, or anything else for that matter. The rock bore heavily down upon us, and I could hardly have turned over to kiss her had I wanted to. Indeed, I could think of nothing else. The punt was so narrow, the length of my side pressed against the length of hers, and I could feel against my hip her sharp little bones. Water in the boat sluiced up occasionally against the back of my knee, the small of my back. Once one is a little wet, one only becomes wetter. Also the cabins were very cool. I began to shiver. After about a minute, the weight of the rock over our faces grew truly intolerable. It might just as well have been the weight of the world. And I could only refrain with difficulty from letting out a great shout when Mary took my hand blindly in her own and pressed it so hard, and we pressed them together finger upon finger, which gave some relief. I discovered at this point that the darkness was owing in part to the fact that I had shut my eyes. I opened them again, and the sense of sliding helplessly in space struck me for the first time. Torchlight exposed above our faces the growing roof of the cavern, covered in calcareous streaks and wet, broken, gleaming, stony teeth. And then the rest of our party appeared at the far shore. By this time we could lift our heads in the boat. My hand almost ached, and I suppose she felt the same, for she let go of mine as soon as the punt touched ground and sat up. "You were very cruel to have left us," she said, to no one in particular, in her own natural, teasing, petulant voice. "The inveterate cousins," Mr. Musters cried. "You see, I mean to adopt Miss Piggott's excellent phrase." He gave her his hand, and she stepped delicately from the boat. "I don't like this cave," Mary continued. "We thought you had all gone. I don't see what is so wonderful about a cave. It's like going to a great house and making sure to visit the cellars or the pantry, or any other dark, dirty corner. It is a low taste." "I agree with you entirely, Miss Charwood," Mrs. Piggott said. "A low taste, and what is worse, it requires lying down in a boat, which I mean to do once more on our return, and then never again as long as I live. For shame, Mother. There is someone here who must do justice to this cave. I have not come all this way to see so little, I quite agree with you about dirty and dark, without at least some elevating reflection on the nature of eternity, or anything you please. But Lord Byron is silent. He has been struck. He suffers what cannot be spoken of, in what we, who speak, have not the sense to feel." And in this way we passed through another succession of caverns, all dripping, all dark, and made our way back out into the sunshine at last. So the story is basically that a guy with my name inherits from someone he used to teach high school with a succession of manuscripts, 2 of which he manages to get published, and the third one which suggests uncomfortable facts about my former colleague's life. And I use those manuscripts as a springboard for an investigation into what he was like. So one of the things that allows me to do is to show my sources. And so here's a small bit that will show what that's like. Last August, my wife and I moved with our 3-year-old daughter to Boston for the year. I had a fellowship from the Radcliffe Institute, which is a part of Harvard, to find out what I could about Peter Sullivan. That's the name of my colleague. This offered me a reprieve from the business of teaching, but of course it offered no reprieve from the business of other people's work. On the first day of class, I want to say, but there were no classes, we met for a kind of assembly in the grand converted gymnasium of old Radcliffe College. The fellows introduced themselves to each other, standing up one at a time like alcoholics. When it was my turn, I said, "I'm writing a book about a guy I used to teach high school with." "Tell us more," the dean called out. I tried to sit down. By the time I knew him, he had basically stopped talking, but he wrote novels, and after his death, I managed to publish 2 of them. I think he might have slept with his students, some of them, or one of them anyway. I want to find out what you can learn about people from the books they write. How much is true? He grew up in Boston. The first thing I did by way of real work was also what required the least effort, the least stepping out of my office. The Radcliffe paid one of the Harvard undergrads to take out library books for the fellows, and I ordered copies of Byron's letters and journals and poems, and Martian's portrait, which Peter had access to himself, and McCarthy's life, which he didn't, and tested Fair Seed Time against them. Fair Seed Time is the name of the story that I just read from. The title, of course, comes from Wordsworth, not Byron. It is the famous opening of the prelude. "Fair seed time had my soul, and I grew up fostered alike by beauty and by fear." I found an odd echo of the word in one of Byron's journal entries. "What a strange thing is the propagation of life. A bubble of seed, which may be spilt in a whore's lap, might, for aught we know, have formed a Caesar or a Bonaparte." But none of this was likely to yield much insight into Peter's private life. What I wanted was to find the parts of his story that didn't stand up to the history, which he might have invented himself or drawn on his own experience for. Peter had been accused at Beaumont Hill of improper sexual relations with a teenage boy. Fair Seed Time tells the story of the rape or seduction of a teenage boy. It struck me as unlikely that there was no connection between them. I began by going over Byron's letters, sentence by sentence, and looking for anything Peter might have used. This turned out to be dispiriting. The letters are 12 volumes long. Any life, even a life as vivid as Byron's, contains a great deal of material unsuitable for fiction. And I waded through pages of description, in-jokes, plans, apologies, printer's corrections, and intimate references to people I had never heard of. But there were discoveries that made the task bearable. Throwaway lines from the letters would suddenly reverberate because I had read them before in one of the novels. And I still remember the excitement I felt on coming across in one of the later journals the following entry. When I was 15 years of age, it happened that in a cavern in Derbyshire, I had to cross in a boat in which 2 people only could lie down, a stream which flows under a rock, with the rock so close upon the water as to admit the boat only to be pushed on by a ferryman, a sort of cherub, who wades at the stern, stooping all the time. The companion of my transit was Mary Chalwood, with whom I had been long in love and never told it, though she had discovered it without. I recollect my sensations, but cannot describe them, and it is as well. We were a party, Mr. W., 2 Miss W's, Mr. and Mrs. Clark, Miss R., and my M.A.C., alas. Why do I say my? Our union would have healed feuds in which blood had been shed by our fathers. It would have joined lands broad and rich. It would have joined at least 1 heart and 2 persons not ill-matched in years. She's 2 years my elder. And what has been the result? She has married a man older than herself, been wretched and separated. I have married and am separated, and yet we are not united. At some point, Peter had read this passage. I felt him almost looking over my shoulder. But the excitement didn't last. I wanted discrepancies, not facts, and most of Peter's discrepancies turned out to be trivial. He left Mrs. Clark at home and widowed her, brought only one of the Miss Wollastons, but all of the Piggotts, and included John Musters, whom Mary Charlworth eventually married. All of this proved dispiriting in a different way. It's true that I was getting closer to Peter, to the way he worked. I saw him again and again take a line from a letter or biography and spin it out into a scene or a piece of analysis. Mary, for example, really did refuse to dance with Byron in Matlock Bath. He was heartbroken. The line employed by Peter to do the breaking, "What, do you think I could care anything for that lame boy?" was lifted almost verbatim from Martian's portrait. If Byron didn't overhear her saying it at the ball, she was probably speaking to her maid, not John Musters. Novelists write shorthand. I knew that already. But finding out the facts behind Peter's story broke whatever spell of truth or truthfulness it had cast on me.